Lie back and relax. Close your eyes and focus on your breathing. Take a deep, rejuvenating breath in, and as you breathe out, feel your body relax and melt into your comfortable mattress. In tonight's story, we join Nick Carraway as he meets the elusive Great Gatsby at one of his infamous, glamorous New York parties. I'm your narrator, Jared Wright, and this is an excerpt from The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, adapted for Sleepiest by Alicia Ainsley. There was music from my neighbor's house through the summer nights. In his gardens, men and women came and went like moths among the whisperings and the champagne and the stars. At high tide in the afternoon, I watched his guests diving from the tower of his raft into the waters at the edge of his garden, or taking in the sun on the hot sand of his beach while his 2 motorboats glided over the waters of the Sound, leaving trails of bubbling foam in their wake. On weekends, his Rolls-Royce became an omnibus, bearing parties to and from the city between 9 in the morning and long past midnight, while his station wagon scampered like a brisk yellow bug to meet all trains. And on Mondays, 8 servants, including an extra gardener, toiled all day with mops and scrubbing brushes and hammers and garden shears, repairing the ravages of the night before. Every Friday, 5 crates of oranges and lemons arrived from a fruiterer in New York. Every Monday, these same oranges and lemons left his back door in a pyramid of pulpless halves. There was a machine in the kitchen which could extract the juice of 200 oranges in half an hour if a little button was pressed 200 times by a butler's thumb. At least once a fortnight, a troupe of caterers came down with several 100 feet of canvas and enough colored lights to make a Christmas tree of Gatsby's enormous garden. On buffet tables, garnished with glistening hors d'oeuvre, spiced baked hams crowded against salads of harlequin designs, and pastry pigs and turkeys bewitched to a dark gold. In the main hall, a bar with a real brass rail was set up, and stocked with gins and liquors, and with cordials so long forgotten that most of his guests didn't know one from another. By 7 o'clock, the orchestra has arrived. No thin 5-piece affair, but a whole pit full of oboes and trombones and saxophones and viols and cornets and piccolos and low and high drums. The last swimmers have come in from the beach now and are dressing upstairs. The cars from New York are parked 5 deep in the drive, and already the halls and salons and verandas are gaudy with primary colors, and hair bobbed in strange new ways, and shawls beyond the dreams of Castile. The bar is in full swing, and floating rounds of cocktails permeate the garden outside, until the air is alive with chatter and laughter and casual innuendo and introductions forgotten on the spot, and enthusiastic meetings between people who never knew each other's names. The light grows brighter as the earth lurches away from the sun, and now the orchestra is playing yellow cocktail music, and the opera of voices pitches a key higher. Laughter is easier minute by minute, spilled with prodigality, tipped out at a cheerful word. The groups change more swiftly, swell with new arrivals, dissolve and form in the same breath. Already there are wanderers, confident women who weave here and there among the stouter and more stable, become for a sharp, joyous moment the center of a group, and then, excited with triumph, glide on through the sea change of faces and voices and color under the constantly changing light. I watch as one woman, in trembling opal, dances out alone on the canvas platform. A momentary hush. The orchestra leader varies his rhythm obligingly for her, and there is a burst of chatter as the erroneous news goes around that she is Gilda Gray's understudy from the Follies. The party has begun. I believe that on the first night I went to Gatsby's house, I was one of the few guests who had actually been invited. People were not invited. They went there. They got into automobiles which bore them out to Long Island, and somehow they ended up at Gatsby's door. Once there, they were introduced by somebody who knew Gatsby, and after that they conducted themselves according to the rules of behavior associated with an amusement park. Sometimes they came and went without having met Gatsby at all, came for the party with a simplicity of heart that was its own ticket of admission. I had been actually invited. A chauffeur in a uniform of robin's egg blue crossed my lawn early that Saturday morning with a surprisingly formal note from his employer. The honor would be entirely Gatsby's, it said, if I would attend his little party that night. He had seen me several times and had intended to call on me long before, but a peculiar combination of circumstances had prevented it. Signed, J. Gatsby, in a majestic hand. Dressed up in white flannels, I went over to his lawn a little after 7 and wandered around, feeling lost among swirls and eddies of people I didn't know, though here and there was a face I had noticed on the commuting train. I was immediately struck by the number of young Englishmen dotted about, all well-dressed, all looking a little hungry, and all talking in low, earnest voices to solid and prosperous Americans. I was sure that they were selling something, bonds or insurance or automobiles. They were at least aware of the easy money in the vicinity, and convinced that it was theirs for a few words in the right key. As soon as I arrived, I made an attempt to find my host, but the 2 or 3 people of whom I asked his whereabouts stared at me in such an amazed way, and denied so vehemently any knowledge of his movements, that I slunk off in the direction of the cocktail table, the only place in the garden where a single man could linger without looking purposeless and alone. It was then that Jordan Baker came out of the house and stood at the head of the marble steps, leaning a little backward and looking with contemptuous interest down into the garden. Welcome or not, I found it necessary to attach myself to someone before I should begin to address cordial remarks to the passers-by. "Hello," I called, advancing toward her. "I thought you might be here," she responded absently as I came up. "I remembered you lived next door to—" She held my hand impersonally, as a promise that she'd take care of me in a minute, and gave her ear to 2 ladies in twin yellow dresses who stopped at the foot of the steps. "Hello," they cried together. "Sorry you didn't win." That was for the golf tournament. She had lost in the finals the week before. "You don't know who we are," said one of the women in yellow, "but we met you here about a month ago." "You've dyed your hair since then," remarked Jordan. Just as I attempted to join in with the conversation, the women had moved casually on, and Jordan's remark was addressed to the premature moon, produced like supper, no doubt, out of a caterer's basket. With Jordan's slender golden arm resting in mine, we descended the steps and sauntered about the garden. A tray of drinks floated at us through the twilight, and we sat down at a table with the two ladies in yellow and three men, each one introduced to us as Mr. Mumble. "Do you come to these parties often?" inquired Jordan of the woman beside her. "The last one was the one I met you at," answered the woman in a confident voice. She turned to her companion. "Wasn't it for you, Lucille?" It was for Lucille, too. "I like to come," Lucille said. "I never care what I do, so I always have a good time. When I was here last, I tore my gown on a chair, and Mr. Gatsby asked me my name and address. Inside of a week, I got a package from Quarrier's with a new evening gown in it. Did you keep it?" asked Jordan. "Sure I did. I was going to wear it tonight, but it was too big and had to be altered. It was gas blue with lavender beads. $265. There's something funny about a fellow that'll do a thing like that," said the other woman eagerly. "He doesn't want any trouble with anybody." "Who doesn't?" I stated. We all turned and looked around for Gatsby. It was testimony to the romantic speculation he inspired that there were whispers about him from those who had found little that it was necessary to whisper about in this world. The first supper, there would be another one after midnight, was now being served, and Jordan invited me to join her own party, who were spread around a table on the other side of the garden. There were 3 married couples and Jordan's companion, a persistent undergraduate obviously under the impression that sooner or later Jordan was going to yield him up to her person to a greater or lesser degree. Instead of rambling, this party had preserved a dignified homogeneity and assumed to itself the function of representing the staid nobility of the countryside, East Egg condescending to West Egg and carefully on guard against its spectroscopic gaiety. "Let's get out," whispered Jordan, after a somehow wasteful and inappropriate half-hour. "This is much too polite for me." We got up, and she explained that we were going to find the host. I had never met him, she said, and it was making me even more curious. The bar, where we glanced first, was crowded, but Gatsby was not there. She couldn't find him from the top of the steps, and he wasn't on the veranda. On a chance, we tried an important-looking door and walked into a high Gothic library, paneled with carved English oak, and probably transported complete from some ruin overseas. He wasn't in there. There was dancing now on the canvas in the garden, men waltzing ladies backward in eternal, graceless circles, superior couples holding each other fashionably and keeping in the corners, and a great number of women dancing individually or relieving the orchestra for a moment of the burden of the banjo or the traps. By midnight, the hilarity had increased. A celebrated tenor had sung in Italian, and a notorious contralto had sung in jazz. And between the numbers, people were doing stunts all over the garden, while happy, vacuous bursts of laughter rose toward the summer sky. A pair of stage twins, who turned out to be the women in yellow, performed a dance to the guests, and champagne was served in glasses bigger than finger bowls. The moon had risen higher, and floating in the sound was a triangle of silver scales, trembling a little to the stiff, tinny drip of the banjos on the lawn. I was still with Jordan Baker. We were sitting at a table with a man of about my age. I was enjoying myself now. The scene had changed before my eyes into something significant, elemental, and profound. At a lull in the entertainment, the man looked at me and smiled. "Your face is familiar," he said politely. "Weren't you in the 1st Division during the war?" "Why, yes, I was in the 28th Infantry. I was in the 16th until June 1918. I knew I'd seen you somewhere before." We talked for a moment about some quaint little villages in France. Evidently, he lived in this vicinity, for he told me that he had just bought a hydroplane and was going to try it out in the morning. "Want to go with me, old sport? Just near the shore along the Sound?" "What time?" I asked. "Any time that suits you best," he replied. It was on the tip of my tongue to ask his name when Jordan looked around and smiled. "Having a good time now?" she inquired. "Much better." I turned again to my new acquaintance. "This is an unusual party for me. I haven't even seen the host. I live over there." I waved my hand at the invisible hedge in the distance. "And this man Gatsby sent over his chauffeur with an invitation." For a moment he looked at me as if he failed to understand. "I'm Gatsby," he said suddenly. "What?" I exclaimed. "Oh, I beg your pardon. I thought you knew, old sport. I'm afraid I'm not a very good host." He smiled understandingly, much more than understandingly. It was one of those rare smiles with the quality of eternal reassurance in it that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. It faced, or seemed to face, the whole eternal world for an instant, and then concentrated on you with an irresistible prejudice in your favor. It understood you just so far as you wanted to be understood, believed in you as you would like to believe in yourself, and assured you that it had precisely the impression of you that, at your best, you hoped to convey. Precisely at that point, it vanished, and I was looking at an elegant young roughneck, a year or two over 30, whose elaborate formality of speech just missed being absurd. Some time before he introduced himself, I'd got a strong impression that he was picking his words with care. Almost at the moment when Mr. Gatsby identified himself, a butler hurried toward him with the information that Chicago was calling him on the wire. He excused himself with a small bow that included each of us in turn. "If you want anything, just ask for it, old sport," he urged. "Excuse me. I will rejoin you later." When he was gone, I turned immediately to Jordan, constrained to assure her of my surprise. I had expected that Mr. Gatsby would be a florid and corpulent person in his middle years. "Who is he?" I asked. "Do you know?" "He's just a man named Gatsby," she replied nonchalantly. "Where is he from, I mean? And what does he do?" I prodded. "Now you're started on the subject," she answered with a wan smile. "Well, he told me once he was an Oxford man." A dim background started to take shape behind him, but at her next remark it faded away. "However, I don't believe it," she said. "Why not?" I inquired, curiously. "I don't know," she insisted. "I just don't think he went there." I would have accepted without question the information that Gatsby sprang from the swamps of Louisiana or from the Lower East Side of New York. That was comprehensible. But young men didn't. At least, in my provincial inexperience, I believed they didn't. Drift coolly out of nowhere and buy a palace on Long Island Sound. "Anyhow, he gives large parties," said Jordan, changing the subject with an urban distaste for the concrete. "And I like large parties. They're so intimate. At small parties, there isn't any privacy." There was the soft beat of a bass drum, and the voice of the orchestra leader rang out suddenly above the echolalia of the garden. "Ladies and gentlemen," he cried, "at the request of Mr. Gatsby, we are going to play for you Mr. Vladimir Tostof's latest work, which attracted so much attention at Carnegie Hall last May. If you read the papers, you know there was a big sensation." He smiled with jovial condescension and added, "Some sensation," whereupon everybody laughed. The piece is known as Vladimir Tostof's Jazz History of the World. The nature of Mr. Tostof's composition eluded me, because just as it began, my eyes fell on Gatsby, standing alone on the marble steps and looking from one group to another with approving eyes. His tanned skin was drawn attractively tight on his face, and his short hair looked as though it were trimmed every day. It seemed to me that he grew more correct as the crowd's hilarity increased. "I beg your pardon." A voice interrupted my thoughts. Gatsby's butler was suddenly standing beside us. "Miss Baker?" he inquired. "I beg your pardon, but Mr. Gatsby would like to speak to you." "With me?" she exclaimed in surprise. "Yes, madam." Gatsby's butler smiled. She got up slowly, raising her eyebrows at me in astonishment and glee, and followed the butler toward the house. I noticed that she wore her evening dress, all her dresses like sports clothes. There was a jauntiness about her movements, as if she had first learned to walk upon golf courses on clean, crisp mornings. I was alone, and it was almost 2. I wondered what Gatsby could possibly want to discuss with Jordan as the party drew to a close. Eluding Jordan's companion, who was now engaged in an obstetrical conversation with 2 chorus girls, and who implored me to join him, I went inside. The large room was full of people. One of the women in yellow was playing the piano, and beside her stood a tall, red-haired young lady from a famous chorus engaged in song. As I waited for my hat in the hall, the door of the library opened, and Jordan Baker and Gatsby came out together. He was saying some last word to her, but the eagerness in his manner tightened abruptly into formality as several people approached him to say goodbye. Jordan's party were calling impatiently to her from the porch, but she lingered for a moment to shake hands. "I've just heard the most amazing thing," she whispered. "How long were we in there?" "Why, about an hour, I guessed." "It was simply amazing," she repeated abstractedly. "But I swore I wouldn't tell it, and here I am tantalizing you." She yawned gracefully in my face. "Please come and see me. Phone book under the name of Mrs. Sigourney Howard, my aunt." She was hurrying off as she talked. Her hand waved a jaunty salute as she melted into her party at the door. Rather ashamed that on my first appearance I had stayed so late, I joined the last of Gatsby's guests, who were clustered around him. I wanted to explain that I'd hunted for him early in the evening, and to apologize for not having known him in the garden. "Don't mention it," he enjoined me eagerly. "Don't give it another thought, old sport." The familiar expression held no more familiarity than the hand which reassuringly brushed my shoulder. "And don't forget, we're going up in the hydroplane tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Then the butler, behind his shoulder, "Philadelphia wants you on the phone, sir." "All right, in a minute. Tell them I'll be right there. Good night." He smiled, and suddenly there seemed to be a pleasant significance in having been among the last to go, as if he had desired it all the time. "Good night, old sport. Good night." After this night, life continued as normal. Most of the time I worked. In the early morning, the sun threw my shadow westward as I hurried down the white chasms of lower New York to the Probity Trust. I knew the other clerks and young bond salesmen by their first names, and lunched with them in dark, crowded restaurants on little sausages and mashed potatoes and coffee. I took dinner, usually at the Yale Club, and then I went upstairs to the library and studied investments and securities for a conscientious hour. The peace and tranquility of the library made it a good place to work. After that, if the night was mellow, I strolled down Madison Avenue past the old Murray Hill Hotel and over 33rd Street to the Pennsylvania Station. I began to like New York. The racy, adventurous feel of it at night, and the satisfaction that the constant flicker of men and women and machine gives to the restless eye. For a while, I lost sight of Jordan Baker, and then in midsummer I found her again. At first, I was flattered to go places with her, because she was a golf champion, and everyone knew her name. Then it was something more. I wasn't actually in love, but I felt a sort of tender curiosity. The bored, haughty face that she turned to the world concealed something. Most affectations conceal something eventually, even though they don't in the beginning. I hoped that one day I would know Jordan Baker well enough to break through her tough exterior. At 9 o'clock one morning late in July, Gatsby's gorgeous car lurched up the rocky drive to my door and gave out a burst of melody from its three-noted horn. It was the first time he had called on me, though I had gone to two of his parties, flown in his hydroplane, and at his invitation made frequent use of his beach. "Good morning, old sport," he hollered. "You're having lunch with me today, and I thought we'd ride up together." He was balancing himself on the dashboard of his car with that resourcefulness of movement that is so peculiarly American, that comes, I suppose, with the absence of lifting work in youth, and even more with the formless grace of our nervous, sporadic games. This quality was continually breaking through his punctilious manner in the shape of restlessness. He was never quite still. there was always a tapping foot somewhere, or the impatient opening and closing of a hand. He saw me looking with admiration at his car. "It's pretty, isn't it, old sport?" He jumped off to give me a better view. "Haven't you ever seen it before?" I'd seen it. Everybody had seen it. It was a rich cream color, bright with nickel, swollen here and there in its monstrous length, with triumphant hat boxes and supper boxes and tool boxes, and terraced with a labyrinth of windshields that mirrored a dozen suns. Sitting down behind many layers of glass in a sort of green leather conservatory, we started to town. I had talked with him perhaps half a dozen times in the past month, and found, to my disappointment, that he had little to say. So my first impression that he was a person of some undefined consequence had gradually faded, and he had become simply the proprietor of an elaborate roadhouse next door. And then came that ride in his car. We hadn't reached West Egg Village before Gatsby began leaving his elegant sentences unfinished and slapping himself indecisively on the knee of his caramel-colored suit. "Look here, old sport," he broke out surprisingly. "What's your opinion of me, anyhow?" Taken off guard, I began the generalized evasions which that question deserves. "Well, I'm going to tell you something about my life," he interrupted. "I'll tell you God's truth." His right hand suddenly ordered divine retribution to stand by. I am the son of some wealthy people in the Middle West, all gone now. I was brought up in America, but educated at Oxford, because all my ancestors have been educated there for many years. It is a family tradition. He looked at me sideways. I came into a good deal of money. For a moment I suspected that he was pulling my leg, but a glance at him convinced me otherwise. After that, I lived like a young Rajah in all the capitals of Europe: Paris, Venice, Rome, collecting jewels, chiefly rubies, hunting big game, painting a little, things for myself only. Here's a little something I always carry, a souvenir of Oxford days. It was taken in Trinity Quad. The man on my left is now the Earl of Doncaster. It was a photograph of half a dozen young men in blazers loafing in an archway through which were visible a host of spires. There was Gatsby, looking a little, not much, younger, with a cricket bat in his hand. Then it was all true. I saw the paintings of tigers hung on the walls of his palace on the Grand Canal. I saw him opening a chest of rubies to ease with their crimson-lighted depths. I'm going to make a big request of you today, he said, pocketing his souvenirs with satisfaction. So I thought you ought to know something about me. I didn't want you to think I was just some nobody. You see, I usually find myself among strangers because I drift here and there so much. He hesitated. You'll hear about it this afternoon. At lunch? I asked. No, this afternoon. I happened to find out that you're taking Miss Baker to tea, Gatsby replied. Do you mean you're in love with Miss Baker? I retorted, quite confused by this turn of events. No, old sport, I'm not, he laughed. But Miss Baker has kindly consented to speak to you about this matter. I hadn't the faintest idea what this matter was, but I was more surprised than interested. I hadn't asked Jordan to tea in order to discuss Mr. J. Gatsby. I was sure the request would be something utterly fantastic, and for a moment I was sorry I'd ever set foot upon his overpopulated lawn. He wouldn't say another word. His correctness grew on him as we neared the city. We passed Port Roosevelt, where there was a glimpse of red-belted ocean-going ships, and sped along a cobbled slum lined with the dark, undeserted saloons of the faded, gilt 1900s. Then the Valley of Ashes opened out on both sides of us, and I had a glimpse of Mrs. Wilson straining at the garage pump with panting vitality as we went by. With fenders spread like wings, we scattered light through half Astoria. Only half, For as we twisted among the pillars of the elevated, I heard the familiar sounds of motorcycles and cars whirring by over the great bridge, with the sunlight through the girders making a constant flicker upon the moving cars, with the city rising up across the river in white heaps and sugar lumps, all built with a wish out of non-olfactory money. The city seen from the Queensborough Bridge is always the city seen for the first time, in its first wild promise of all the mystery and the beauty in the world. A wedding carriage passed us, heaped with blooms, followed by two more cheerful carriages for friends. The friends looked out at us with jovial eyes and wide smiles, and I was glad that the sight of Gatsby's splendid car was included in their celebration. As we crossed Blackwell's Island, a limousine passed us, driven by a chauffeur, in which sat 3 young men. I laughed aloud as the men rolled down their window to gaze at Gatsby's car with admiration. Anything can happen now that we've slid over this bridge, I thought. Anything at all. Even Gatsby could happen without any particular wonder. Perhaps success is possible without having come from a wealthy family. It could only be possible here in the United States. After all, that is why they call it the American dream.